that the people calling for peace are hate marchers.
To my mind, there's only one way to describe those marches. They are hate marches.
And those that actually spew, the likes of Tommy Robinson and his far-right element, but try criticizing Israel. And all of a sudden, you're prone to a litany of accusations and charges. This trap that we are in, the kind of either Labour or Conservative, either Conservative or Labour. It's like this game of musical chairs where you have two players with two chairs. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations. What's my Happy Meal, what's my chicken nuggets gonna do to their economy? But that's not the point, you see. We often come back to the Ukraine. Imagine how the British government responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Immediately, within a matter of hours, a visa system was founded, money was discovered under some mattress, people's homes in their thousands were open to refugees, and the kind of coverage of people's stories, and rightly so, by the way, absolutely rightly so. And then compare that with what's happened with the people of Gaza.
Dr Anas Altikriti holds a PhD in political science from the University of Westminster. He is a former chairman and president of the Muslim Association of Britain. He is also the founder and CEO of the Cordoba Foundation, and he is one of the most prominent Muslim British activists today. Welcome, Dr Anas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So as I've mentioned, you are one of the most prominent British Muslim activists today, and you've actually been active on the scene for over two decades, most notably during America and Britain's war in Iraq. How do you view the activist landscape today in relation to how it's been in the past? How do you view it's changed or evolved?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure being here. And actually, I think I can call myself, or I started calling myself, an activist way longer than 2 decades, unfortunately. But in the public eye, I believe that after 9/11, that's when I became more vocal on mainstream media and on stages of demonstrations and the like. But actually, my activism started when I was about 16, 17, during the British student movement and campaign against the South African apartheid regime. And that's when I first opened my eyes to something called apartheid, to a system that was in South Africa that I had at the time no idea of. And I learned. And I learned how to do things, and I learned how to formulate a message, and I learned how to argue with those, and there were many at the time who thought that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist and that the ANC were a terrorist organization. And that, by the way, was how the British government at the time, the British government under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, viewed those South African blacks who wanted parity, who wanted freedom. So in a way, it mirrors what's happening today in Gaza. But going back to the American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, after 9/11, it was quite clear that we were about to mount or to enter into a phase which was going to be nothing short of historic. And it proved true. 9/11 was a transformative moment. And we still remain, despite the fact that it's now 24 years ago, but still the impact of what happened on 9/11 reverberates until now. And what's happened was that at the time, I was with the Muslim Association of Britain, and we realized that we needed to motivate the Muslim community to come out and to express themselves in regards with what's happening to Afghanistan and what then transpired to be the preparation of a war in Iraq. What's happened during that time in April of 2002 was the massacre of the Jenin refugee camp. And we decided to demonstrate. And that was, I would suggest, the very first time in a very long time that Muslims in Britain wanted to express themselves through that particular way. and a demonstration which we prepared for 3,000 to 5,000 people to turn out got more than 125,000 people, and it was in the central cover page of Time magazine. It was the picture of thousands upon thousands filling the streets of London, was everywhere, and that began the coalition that then became the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
And that took upon itself not only Iraq, which culminated in the 2 million march in February 2003, still, till this day, the biggest march in the history of the country, but also constantly raising the flag of Palestine. In fact, quite interestingly, and this is probably part of history now, when we were negotiating with Stop the War Coalition at the time, and they said, we need to raise no war in Iraq. And we said, yeah, absolutely fine, no war in Iraq, but also freedom for Palestine. And they objected to that. They said, no. If you have two main slogans, you'll divide people. So what if there are people, and that's the argument they made, what if there are people who are against the war in Iraq and want to join us in the demonstration, but then are not sure about freedom in Palestine? And we try to convince them that the two issues aren't separate, that the issue of Palestine is going to be pertinent. It's always an issue because it is the cause of virtually everything. And very begrudgingly, I recall, they accepted. And 22, 23, almost 24 years on, we were proven correct. And they themselves were more than happy to, the leaders of Stop the War, when they wrote their book, Stop the War, they wrote that. They said these people, meaning us, when they insisted on having Palestine on every single demonstration, regardless of what the theme was, they were proven right. And we thought it was a different cause, it was something else. But it turns out to be at the very heart of most things, in fact, of everything that's happened. So the scene is, I believe, it's grown. I think it's become more politically aware. I think it's definitely become more effective, and for a number of reasons. But I believe that amongst those reasons is the fact that there's that kind of political awareness, and the fact that the messages that now every single time there's a demonstration, those political messages are quite well done, well constructed, well sent, and also effectively received by the decision makers.
We saw in the marches throughout the last few months opposing the genocide in Gaza such not only strong opposition, but quite vulgar opposition, I would say, to it, in which at the time, Home Secretary Suella Braverman called our march a hate march, or called the marches against genocide a hate march. And you had people like Tommy Robinson calling his followers out to supposedly protect the cenotaph on a day in which no marches were going anywhere near it.
Yeah.
And then they ended up getting into fights with the police. So my question is this kind of vitriol that we see today, has that always been the case? And or is this some new development?
It's always been there, but I have to admit that none more so than what we saw and the examples that you cited. Governments hate public demonstrations. Even those that say public demonstrations is a basic right and it's part of democracy. They admit that, but they're not entirely happy when it happens, and therefore there's always going to be government pushback against those marches. Now we have far greater restrictions on public protests and demonstrations and marches than we ever had during my time, around 2001, 2002, 2003. But even then, the government would sort of belittle those marches. There was a famous statement by a prime minister saying, those noisy people, walking down Trafalgar Square, or something like that, along those lines. So either belittling the demonstrations or accusing them of inciting hatred or inciting division or the such. That's always been a government tactic. But I would suggest, in my lifetime at least, I haven't seen the kind of, I would even go as far as to say, determined demonization of the marches and these demonstrations. To call these marches hate marches at a time when the call was basically for a ceasefire is not only ludicrous, it's laughable. To accuse the marchers who were calling for the cessation of violence and to call on Israel to stop the killing of children and women, calling them the violent ones, is absolutely disgraceful. The fact that it was the government that was betraying everything that it calls British values. I mean, when the government comes out and says, what's the definition of extremism? One of the definitions is to violate British values. Well, I'm sorry, but unless British values is about the massacre and slaughter and genocide of an innocent population, then it is the British government in this case that is actually violating those very values of the Britain claims to hold so dear. So that kind of targeting of demonstrations has always been the case. But what we have found is that we have a government, and we have, unfortunately, often some authorities, including on some occasions the police, who try to skew the scene and to show that the people calling for peace are hate marchers, and those that actually spew, I mean, the likes of Tommy Robinson and his far right element, the kind of vulgar demonstration, the kind of vulgar narrative, the kind of vulgar, banners and whatever they have, and yet they are seen to be the ones who are protecting the very heart of Britain. Is, as I said, it's disgraceful, but unfortunately it's become what the country and the government is about today.
Speaking or continuing on the topic of demonstrations and the government and the British establishment, we saw in one of the early marches, and I don't remember his name, but there was a member of parliament, a member of the Labour Party, who mentioned that he wished for peaceful liberty for all peoples from the river to the sea. Yeah. And because of this one comment, he was suspended.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you your thoughts on why is such a harmless comment in which, you're calling for freedom and peace for everyone. Why does that pose such a threat to the establishment?
It's a very good question, and we can all have our own views, some probably ranging from the conspiratorial to what is actually backed by evidence. But clearly, any kind of protest is, can be taken on one side, but any kind of criticism of Israel and the Zionist project is taken in a totally different guise and a totally different light, and is reacted to in a totally manic, totally unreasonable, illogical fashion. We've seen this not only in this country, but around the world. I mean, no one in their right mind would consider accusing anyone, let's say, criticizing the Saudi regime or the Iranian regime or the Pakistani regime as being Islamophobic. Yet the moment you criticize Israel, all of a sudden you're anti-Semitic. It's absolutely ludicrous. You can criticize anyone. In fact, American law, as passed by the American Congress, allows one to criticize the American president and the American government and American society, absolutely, because it's their, Second Amendment. It's the freedom to thought, to expression. But try criticizing Israel, and all of a sudden you're prone to a litany of accusations and charges, the least of which is that you're anti-Semitic. And it could be borderline, you could be risking being accused of even, extremism, probably even more. To imagine that situation, to talk of it, is laughable in its own right. But to imagine it a reality of which has caught up with many student activists, academic activists, people in the press, people in the media, people in the public eye, it's actually caught up with them. People have lost their jobs. Their careers are at risk. Their livelihoods are definitely at risk because of this. Not because they criticize the American government. That's fine. But don't criticize Israel. To think of that is absolutely unimaginable, but unfortunately it's become a feature of our life today. And unfortunately, what you say is correct, that the mere hint that you wish for a free Palestine, you wish for the people who live between the Jordanian River and the Mediterranean Sea to be free, that is so offensive to some that they immediately jump on it and see it as a sackable offense. To even speak of this is, makes the mind boggles. But we've seen it in, as you mentioned, rightly, MPs, political advisors, members of parties have been dismissed, expelled, punished, admonished, because they called for something which one would assume is, to claim or to call for any people in this world to be free from slavery, free from occupation. You would think that that is what any sane human being would call for. But it's become such an offense to authorities today that they have to sack, punish, prosecute those who call for it is where we are today, unfortunately.
As of filming this episode, we are currently in the midst of a general election, and hopefully this episode actually comes out before the election results. But you've been a vocal supporter of the Muslim vote.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a bit more about this campaign and what it's setting out to achieve?
I'm an advisor to the Muslim vote, and someone whom I'm proud to say was amongst a throng of people from throughout the community, whom after Israel began its genocide in Gaza, came together and said this can't go on, and our political authorities seem to be not only toothless, not only helpless, but actually hell-bent on backing Israel in the crime it's committing, and seeing to it that they have whatever weapons they need, whatever support they need, whatever media coverage they require in order to complete and to finish off, to complete their mission and finish off the Palestinian people. And as a result, something needs to be done. We, unfortunately, tragically, we can't save a child in Gaza. But what we can do is to ensure that our government, or any government for that matter, which is happy to be complicit in the committance of this crime, is punished. And that people are aware where their taxes are going, what they're paying to do. They're not paying to sustain our crumbling NHS service or to prop up a failing third world standard education service or to provide job opportunities for youngsters who have graduated from universities with hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, let's say, of pounds of debt around their necks, but in order to prop up an apartheid, racist, criminal, genocidal regime in Tel Aviv. So the idea was that we were about to come to the general election, and that we needed to see to it that the British people, all British people, they needed to see to it that things changed for their betterment, for their best interests, for their better futures. And we recognize that we can start somewhere, and that somewhere was talking to the Muslim community. We're about 6 to 7, probably 8% of the British population. And we have quite a sizable voting proportion amongst that. So we're around 3 million, I would suggest, voters, eligible voters. And we decided that something needed to happen so that basically we can send the kind of message that fits or befits the best interests of the British people, all British people. At the same time, people in various constituencies were thinking of the same. We had the socialists, we had the likes of George Galloway, we had Jeremy Corbyn, we had, various others who were also thinking along this similar lines. And we expected, and I think we were right to expect, that we would have several platforms that would work towards the same objective. And true, I think today we're talking about 13, 14 platforms, the largest of which and the most organized of which is the Muslim Vote. But there are many, many others. And to be honest, every single one of them is playing a pivotal role in trying to find a way out of the trap, this trap that we are in, the kind of either Labour or Conservative, either Conservative or Labour. It's like this game of musical chairs where you have two players with two chairs. And you can never escape. This game is never ending. And there is no resolution to the problems. And no one is getting it, it seems. Today, I mean, you listen to Keir Starmer and you listen to Rishi Sunak and you can barely tell the difference. No one is actually proposing anything different. And when it comes to Israel, and we've seen over the course of the past few days, both proclaiming quite proudly that they are supporters of Israel. In fact, Rishi Sunak had the gall of claiming that one of his proudest moments was the fact that he was the only British Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister, who actually did something in order to assist Israel in its military endeavors. I mean, how not only out of touch, how absolutely repugnant is this, that the Prime Minister of Britain can actually claim pride in being complicit in a genocide. And it beggars belief that these people are supposedly intelligent, yet they not only can't read the room, their own people, the hundreds of thousands every single week who hit the streets throughout the country, but they are almost oblivious to the implications of what the ICJ has said, what the ICC has said, and they're totally unaware, it seems, that, only a few years ago we had a 97-year-old man almost totally out of, his mind and body, who's charged at the ICC, charged of being a security guard, not a commander, not a general, not a decision maker, at Auschwitz, a security guard. And in his old age, days before his death, he was hauled before the entire world as being the epitome of Nazi horror and Nazi crimes against the Jews. And these people don't realize that what is happening can catch up with them, either now or in the near future or in their old age, and that their entire legacies are at risk. And for what? Not for something that is for the betterment of humanity, for the development of humanity, for the alleviation of poverty and hunger and deprivation, but in order to support a genocidal apartheid regime. It's crazy.
But in their eyes, the ICC has set the precedent that it'll turn a blind eye to Western crimes, right? I mean, George Bush and Tony Blair have not been anywhere near the ICC as far as I'm aware. So in their eyes, they've got nothing to worry about.
And that's where we come in. We can't just leave um, leave the system to work its own magic, to work its own wonders. We have to be there. We have a system, okay? It proclaims certain values, certain slogans, which all seem perfect. Now, in practice, obviously, they haven't been working for some reason or another. But now I feel that there is a public appetite around the world that these accusations, that these charges are seen through, and that they become realities, and that those arrest warrants against Netanyahu and against his generals are seen to be delivered, and that these people are actually seen to be behind bars. And once that happens, then, we'll start asking, okay, who were their friends? Who encouraged them? Who egged them on? Who said that they can use whatever means possible against the Palestinian people? And let's have them. And let's have their jobs. And let's have their careers. And let's have their legacies. And let them go through the mill just like they sat in high offices, in lavish offices, as millions of Palestinians in Gaza were rained upon by shells and fire and bullets supplied by us, supplied by factories up and down our cities and towns. So they need to go through the very same, if not even more, of an ordeal that will see that history judges them just as brutally as the Palestinians suffered at the hands of their killers.
You mentioned that one of your goals is to punish those who support genocide, and obviously for the Conservative government it's a given. And in fact, many would say that those in charge deserve arrest warrants as well. And as well as the Labour Party, and early on, and the Keir Starmer, as well as the shadow cabinet, went around saying Israel had the right to do whatever it wants, or use any means, cut off food, water, medicine, etc. Although Labour have changed their tune somewhat now that it's easier to stand up against genocide, or now that 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. However, whilst punishing the Labour Party as a whole, it seems to be the right move, and a lot are calling for that. Some Labour Party members did not toe the party line when it came to voting for ceasefire votes, for example. Some Labour Party members of Parliament went against the whip, and they sacrificed potential positions and sacrificed potential progression in the future in order to vote with their conscience. In those constituencies, should people still aim to punish Labour, or is there something else to be said there?
I think there's an argument for both sides. I think there's an argument that says that, listen, Labour is now beyond the pale. And it's not beyond the pale simply because Keir Starmer appeared at the very start of the genocide against the Palestinians and said that Israel has the right to cut off food, water, aid and the such in order to pursue its agenda. Not only because of that, but Labour now for years has been at the behest of the Zionist lobby here in the UK. And I would always refer to the 3-part documentary done by Al Jazeera a few years back, The Labour Files. It's on YouTube. It's a must-watch. And one would see how deeply in cahoots the Israeli lobby, the Israeli embassy here in London is with Labour, and the kind of cleanup of the kind of, the people like Jeremy Corbyn and all the pro-Palestinians over the course of the past 4 or 5 years has been nothing short of disgraceful, and a total stain, an absolute permanent stain on the legacy of Labour. So Labour, in my mind, is absolutely beyond the pale. However, you bring up a very good point. There are members, lifelong members of Labour, whom at a critical point of time, recognizing the fact that to all intents and purposes, Labour is coming to government, and that Labour MPs who've been MPs for years now have a really solid chance of being in cabinet, ministers, probably even senior ministers, and yet refusing to toe the party line, declaring their condemnation of Israel, their support for Palestine, their support for a ceasefire, despite the whip. I see the argument in that these people, they need to be rewarded for their stands. Those were brave and principled stands, and we mustn't ever, ever turn our backs to anyone who took that kind of stand. But like I said, I see the point that Labour's coming to power, and we mustn't contribute towards Labour getting a supermajority and hence be complacent in how it runs the country over the course of the next 5 years. So I see both sides of the argument. I'm of a position that someone whom within the party refused to take the party line and stood by their principles and will undoubtedly suffer in terms of their chances of progression within the party as a result, that's someone whom I would not find acceptable to turn our backs on. Whether we go as far as to vote for them, that's something that I leave to people. But it's I think that in the future we will come to members of various parties where we will lobby and ask them to stand by their principles and by their values. And if they do, I don't think it's right of us to then deny that or to punish them as a result of that. But that's for the future. Right now, I think that people will make up their own minds, whether they find it even tasteful to tick next to a Labour box, or whether they'll look at the character and the individual themselves and to see what they have given and what they have sacrificed and vote for them. That's something that I leave to people to decide.
And if we zoom out a bit from individual constituencies and we just look at the general landscape, what do you think the consequences will be if Britons do not use their vote to punish those parties in particular who supported the genocide of the Palestinians?
This is quite an interesting and quite an important discussion that I think that people need to have with themselves first and foremost and with their families and closest before we have a public debate about this. Because regardless, every single poll has showed us that Labour are going to win. Some are saying by a huge majority, some maybe less, but still no one is suggesting that Labour won't win. So the question is, I might ask myself, so what's the value of my vote? You see, the value of your vote is that at least you can lay your head down on your pillow when you go to sleep, having felt content and satisfied that you have not sold your soul, that you have not negotiated on your values, on your principles, on your beliefs. You see, we forget sometimes when you tell people about BDS and about not buying Coca-Cola, for instance, or not buying a Happy Meal from McDonald's. And people often would say, well, these are multi-billion dollar corporations. What's my Happy Meal? What's my chicken nuggets going to do to their economy? But that's not the point, you see. The point is you and yourself and how you perceive yourself. Have you done your bit? Have you stood firm by your beliefs and values? Or have you sold out? I mean, it's not about whether Starbucks or Coca-Cola will crumble in the stock markets. That's not the point. If it happens, it happens. But that's not the point. The point is, are we for sale? Are we for sale? Are we willing to give up on our fundamental beliefs and values and the things we believe in and the things we perceive as being criminal, no less than criminal, for a meal, for a Coke, for a, it's that we need to think of. So the very first point of call whenever we tell people to vote is that individual, is myself. Whether my values, my beliefs and my principles allow me to forego that opportunity to do and to say the right thing. And it's I think it's invariably true that whoever gives up on voting and says, "Oh, it's not going to make any difference," they have indirectly voted for the worst possible candidate. So imagine you being in that, ballot or that, before that ballot box, and you're ticking next to the worst candidate of all. That's exactly what you're doing indirectly when you're foregoing on voting. And plus, this is our country. We are part of this country, despite what the racists say, that we are somehow foreigners. We are the other. We are different. We have less. We don't. We're equal to King Charles. We're equal to the Prime Minister. We are equal. But we have to behave as equals. We can't accept the narrative of the racists who tell us we are less. And when I forego on my democratic right to be part of building, a tiny part probably, but a part nonetheless of shaping the future of the country, when I forego on that right, I am proving the narrative that I am less, that I am second class, probably even third class. That's something I absolutely refute and reject.
But some would say that if I supposedly vote with my conscience, that is a vote against Labour, and I might keep the Tories in. What kind of response do you think people like that should?
I think it's a foregone conclusion that the Tories are out. That's one thing. But in the whole scheme of things, I really can't dictate what the shape of the outcome is going to be in its entirety. If it were, I'd rather not have Labour in all honesty. I'd rather have not Labour. I'd rather not have a Labour government because I think that would be to the detriment of the country. The Conservatives were a disaster, but everyone recognised that they were a disaster. Even Conservatives recognised that they were a disaster. That's why there's an exodus away from the Conservatives to the far right in the form of Reform UK. So everyone recognised that they're a disaster. But the problem is that the vast majority believe in the lie that Labour constitute change, that Labour are going to provide something else, to bring something different, to change the way that the country is. They're not. And so I don't think that's a real consideration. And listen, we must recognize something. I mean, whilst today we've discussed Palestine, obviously that's a thing that many people are thinking about day and night. And most people from the Arab and Muslim communities, but also the wider society, are going to vote on Thursday based on their perception of Gaza. But at the same time, believe you me, it's very much local that we're thinking. I mean, someone asked me, or several people actually asked the question, well, shouldn't we be focusing on local? How about me saying that Gaza isn't really that distant at all? And in fact, if I'm thinking local, if I'm thinking about our NHS, if I'm thinking about our hospitals, if I'm thinking about our futures, our taxation, about transportation, about jobs and employment, I could as well be talking about Gaza. And how on earth could I ever entrust someone with the NHS, with our future health, with the health of my parents, with the health of our vulnerable, the ill, and give it to someone who saw a massacre against the children, the ill, the babies in incubators in Gaza, and yet refused to vote for a ceasefire. When an MP has that power to vote against the continuation of a murder being committed, and yet refrains from taking that opportunity, that is someone I would never, ever entrust with my health, with my life, with my children's education, with the future of my country. So believe you me, it might seem that Gaza is several thousand miles away, but in reality it's not. In reality, it's very much local. When I'm voting to bring in a government that I'm hoping would make my country better, I cannot afford to give it to a crop of people, to a party that was hell-bent on making the lives of millions of Palestinians worse. That cannot happen.
As you mentioned, the Gaza is actually a lot closer to home than many people may think. And this has possibly been one of the reasons that Palestine has united so many people of conscience all across the world. But it's also mobilized them to a degree that we probably haven't seen since the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. What do you think fuels not only this united front, but also the great level of mobilization we've seen around the world?
I think the images that people have seen, the fact that, we've always had this core group of pro-Palestine campaigners. Jeremy Corbyn, for as long as I've known him, and I've known him for a long, long time, he's always been extremely solid on Palestine. George Galloway has always been solid on Palestine, way before Palestine became popular, if you know what I mean. But what has changed, and it's changed over the course of the past, let's say, 10, 15 years, and particularly since the siege of Gaza. You see, the thing is, sometimes there are things that we forget about. But the siege of Gaza in 2006, 2007, at the time I remember having a discussion at one of London's universities. There was a panel. And I think it was about 2008, and the siege had been going on for about a year and a bit. And I remember telling people about what a siege actually means. And I was drawing on my experience, not my personally, but my knowledge of what happened in Iraq when Iraq was under siege by the sanctions, the economic sanctions from 1990 until about 2003, for about 13 years. And I remember one panelist who was adopting an opposing view. He sort of flippantly said, Don't worry. I mean, don't be so dramatic. This is not going to be a 13-year thing. And yet now it's almost 17 years. That, and whilst we become almost normalized to the fact that there's a siege that Gaza lives under, but for many people, and especially the young, who grow up with sort of absolute values of black and white, truth and falsehood, right and wrong, bad and good, that doesn't make sense. It simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter whether they know much about the history of Palestine. It doesn't matter much that they know about the story of Zionism. It doesn't matter much that they know or don't about the 1948 Nakba. It doesn't matter. What they do know is, hang on, you're telling me that there are 2.5 million people who have been under siege for 17 years. Now, tell that to any 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old, and none of them, I assure you, none of them, regardless of faith, ethnicity, creed, or culture, no one will say, well, that seems like a good idea. No one will say that. And you mustn't undervalue the intuition the natural instincts of people, because those are the very first emotions that go through anyone's minds when they come across something as horrific as the siege of Gaza, for instance. Add to that the element that we have today that I didn't have during South Africa, and I had far less of during Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001, 2003, and that is social media. The fact that today people are exposed to countless images a day, to news reports by their hundreds every single day. The fact that people, as a result of this barrage of data and image and information and the such, have the feeling that they are there. And when you have a generation of non-indoctrinated youngsters who themselves are facing immense challenges in terms of their education, their liberties, the world is throwing upon their young shoulders in terms of exposure and influence, and then they are confronted with the horror that unfolds before their very eyes. It becomes personal. It's not about someone else anymore. And that's why you and I, when we take the tube, for instance, or get on a bus, the most striking scene is how many people are wearing the kufiya, the Palestinian kufiya. And I've recently come across some adornments like the bracelet, for instance, or people's gloves, or, it's not just the normal kufiya anymore. People have taken this to another level. The watermelon. I mean, this has become almost, you only have to look around you at any public gathering, whether it be a bus stop or on the train or anywhere else in the park. And you see these emblems and you realize that this is something personal. It's not about something that's happening, a distance away. This is very, very much local, and people are taking it to heart. I've spoken to many. I've gone across the country and spoken to university encampments, and I've lost count of how many people have come up to me and say that they themselves feel offended, and they're not Palestinians, they're not Arabs. Many of them aren't even Muslims, and yet they express so profoundly how personal this is and this has been to them. And that kind of reaction, that kind of reception is something you can never downplay. You can never convince this generation, oh, by the way, don't worry about it. It's happening, quite a distance away, and it doesn't affect you in any way. These people are already affected. And therefore, there's something. And by the way, Palestine particularly, it's totally different. I discovered this. I hail from Iraq, and I led that 2 million march. And I remember that day as being one of my best days, one of my most glorious days. But I have to say that Palestine is absolutely different. The way people connect with Palestine and with the Palestinian issue is on a totally different level. And I think it's because of how deep people feel totally offended by what has happened to the Palestinians over the course of the past 76 years.
Speaking of the connection that people have to Palestine, as you said, the people have very deep connection. And whilst Gaza genocide is one of, if not the greatest crime of our generation, there are many others across the globe who suffer in similar ways, such as those in Sudan, in the Congo.
The Rohingya. Kashmiris, the Uyghurs and the such.
And they don't get anywhere near as much attention as Palestine. Why do you think that's the case? And what can we do as people of conscience to bring light to these places and the suffering.
I agree, and it's tragic. It's tragic, and particularly that Sudan, for instance, which has been ongoing for about 16, 17 months now, well, about 16 months, is just as tragic in terms of the numbers of displaced. We have about 12 million displaced. We have millions who are living in conditions that are so horrific that you can't even put in words how horrific those conditions are. Rape, assault, kidnapping, and the list goes on. You talk about Congo, you talk about Kashmir, the world is riddled with injustice. And if nothing else, then this is the biggest indicator that as a political structure, the international community, as they call it, has failed utterly. And, that young generation that I spoke of is now aware of this, that despite the incredible advancements in medicine, technology, communication, finance, we have far more billionaires today than we have ever had across human history. And you'd think that that would bring some level of happiness, of contentment, of satisfaction, of achievement. But it brings greater conflict, it brings greater outbreak of disease, greater poverty, greater deprivation, greater injustice, greater oppression, greater mental health, greater rates of suicide, of total disparity, of greater gaps between rich and poor than ever before. And that tells us of the utter failure of the current political class around the world. Palestine, which we've spoken about, and which constitutes the cornerstone of this, because it is in a way emblematic of everything that happens, everything else, unfortunately. But it just shows that it's unfortunate. I mean, if only we had the attention span to consider all these cases together. If only we had a media that would tell the stories of these tragedies and catastrophes happening around the world. If only we had the morality to treat all victims as equal. I mean, it saddens me that we often come back to the Ukraine. I mean, imagine how the British government responded to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Immediately, within a matter of hours, a visa system was founded, money was discovered under some mattress, people's homes in their thousands were open to refugees, and the kind of coverage of people's stories, and rightly so, by the way, absolutely rightly so. And then compare that with what's happened with the people of Gaza. Just the other day, I heard the news that the very first Gazan orphaned by the Israeli attacks, was allowed in the UK. I mean, imagine how disgraceful that sounds. Imagine how pathetic that sounds. Imagine what a slap across the face of those in power and authority that constitutes, that headline. Seriously, I mean, if there was a campaign to be run, that headline should have been cut out of a physical newspaper and sent to every single Conservative cabinet member and MP. Seriously. I mean, how disgraceful is that? And why is that? It's because people aren't equal in our eyes. People don't mean the same in our eyes. People's blood does not mean the same in our eyes. And that is the epitome of bestiality, of the level of deprivation and depravity that human beings can achieve and can stoop to. And unfortunately, that's where we are today. I wish that that we can give equal attention to all tragedies, all occupations, all oppressions, all injustices around the world, whether they be man-made, such as wars and the results of catastrophes because of our mining and our seeking mineral resources or the such, or whether it be natural disasters, famines and floods and earthquakes and the such. I wish, essentially, due to the factors I spoke of, unfortunately, we have to pay attention to one area, neglect another, then discover that that problem has been going on for a little bit too long, and now it's becoming a little bit problematic to our economy and our state of mind, so we need to pay a little bit attention to that, and so on and so forth. But we have a problem, and that problem needs to be addressed.
Is there anything that can be done on an individual level, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to speak of the issue of injustice. I think that essentially all of this comes down to injustice. And that injustice can be captured in economic terms, or it could be in political, military terms, strategic terms, or the such. But essentially, we're talking about injustice. I mean, we could be talking about Syria and the people of Syria and what they've suffered at the hands of their regime for now 13 years. And we can talk about the victims of a flood that in one way or another, the industrial world contributed towards by climate change or by manufacturing beyond the land's means or the such. And we need to start talking about it. We need to start having that conversation. And unfortunately, in the past 10, 15, probably 20 years, there have been some, and with no disrespect to any true endeavors played by some, but generally speaking, these have been more gimmicks. Like I remember Malala, being hauled before every conference, every convention, she was like the icon. The world was fighting back against regression, against backwardness, against injustice, against oppression. This was the world. We were fine. And then Malala grows up and gets married, and all of a sudden she's seen as a betrayal.
Yeah. Because
she was used as a political tool. Not because she actually carried anything of value, but because she was a useful political bull.
And we see the opposite with Greta Thunberg.
And with Greta Thunberg, the same. And we see the opposite because now she represents something, and now we need to demonize her so that... And it's a very dirty game, because what is at stake are people's lives. And we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about nations, swathes of human populations that are at stake because of our need and desire and craving for, celebrities and icons and enemies and sort of evil individuals to target, and it's just for headline grabbing, and there's no real intent or desire to actually solve anything.
On a final note, I'd like to ask you if you could kind of, in a summary, how, in your view, has the Gaza genocide affected the relationship between Muslims, and specifically Western Muslims, with Western establishments?
I would like to think of Western Muslims as being, hopefully, ideal citizens. The values of Islam are universal values. As a Muslim, if I was to not only believe in but implement those values, I would be a model citizen of any country I claim to be part of, whether it be the UK, the US, any European country, anywhere in the entire world. I think it's wrong of us, as well as of others, to think of Western Muslims as being a class of their own. I think it's about time that those regarded themselves as not only an integral, inseparable part of the fabric of their societies, but more importantly, part of their futures. And that is truly, truly imperative if we are hoping to make any kind of change. The fracture, and I think there is a fracture with Western establishment, with the international community, with governments, is a fracture based on those values, on those humane values, which most people believe in. And I believe that that's something that is not specific to Western Muslims. I can see that now swathes of, here in the UK, British people have the same kind of dissociation with authority, and particularly with governments. And I'm hoping, I can't say for sure, but I'm hoping that that is the first step towards radical transformation, radical change, where people decide that they can't any longer linger whilst governments play havoc with their lives and other people's lives. I'm hoping that it's a beginning of a change. I'm hoping that the elections will bring about results which will show that people are tired of the same system. In America, this contest that is exhausting billions of dollars ends up with Biden and Trump, and then we're supposed to think that this is some sort of democracy, that this is some sort of free choice that people have. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is laughable. This is a circus. This is a circus, and we're paying spectators. But we can't have this anymore, because what's at risk is people's lives, the futures of nations, is probable disaster and catastrophe on every single level, and we must put an end to that.
Thank you so much, Dr Anas. It was a real pleasure to have you with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Faris.